Thank you very much, Amelia, and thank you and welcome back, everyone, as we move now to panel 2 on day 1 of Governance Week 2024, as we focus on our overarching promoting exceptional governance for small states. So we had a really great start to the day with executing board strategy from Cecile Watson. Now, that was followed by panel 1 with Kimberly Iriah Ali leading a wonderful panel of Sandra Osborne, Dr. Charlene Sharp, and Brian Glasgow. And they looked at the differentiating the board strategy from the organizational strategy, leading really nicely into what is now going to be our topic for panel 2, breaking the status quo in the boardroom. Our moderator is Derek Luk Pat, and his panelists would be Latoya Garcia Henry, Felicia Linch, and Dr. Noveck Gowandan. So I want to very briefly introduce Derek. As we have shared before, full bios are available in the agendas we have sent to all of you, and therefore we will just very briefly do introductions to move on with the discussions. So, Derek Eduardo Luk Pat is a father of one, an entrepreneur, a business consultant, and most recently, a circular economy specialist whose 25 years of experience covers several sectors across the Caribbean at senior levels in private, public, and the NGO sectors. He's actively involved in the current international standards development for circular economy as a member of the ISO Technical Committee 323, the ISO TC 323 Chairman's Advisory Group, and serves as the chair of the Trinidad and Tobago National Mirror Committee for ISO TC 323. And he was recently appointed chairman of the Advancing Circular Economy Program under the Caribbean Biodiversity Fund. So someone who has done a lot of work in the circular economy space and who shares a lot of similar passions that we have here at CCGI for wanting to see the circular economy concept really build in the region. And it fits into this whole regenerative capitalism theme of how we get businesses to be able to improve what they do. So Derek, we gave you the very challenging task of dissecting this whole topic of breaking the status quo in the boardroom. So I invite you now to introduce your panel and take over the session.
Thanks, Kamala. And once again, I appreciate the opportunity to participate and to contribute towards Governance Week 2024. I think, Kamala, you clearly do your homework, because when I saw the topic that you selected for me to moderate, that's another area that I'm quite passionate about. And trying to do that, breaking of the status quo is an art in itself. So I'm pleased to introduce my panelists, Latoya Garcia Henry, Dr. Noveck J. Gowandan, and I hope before long we will have Ms. Felicia Linch. So so we're going to have everybody on stage. And also, Kamala, clearly the homework on the panelists also was quite good, because when you looked at the the little brief descriptors from the on the panelists, we have and I hope everybody's okay with first names. I have Noveck, who has a PhD in governance. It's probably one of the few people in the world that probably has this, and clearly is passionate about that. So look forward to hearing his contributions. We have Felicia, who, quote unquote, amongst her many bios, rarely, rarely accepts the status quo or conformity. So she's probably quite a lot of fun to have at the board table. And of course, we have Latoya, who is a governance enthusiast. So I think it's a fantastic mix we have on the panel. And if I could hand it over, so as to not monologue, if I could ask you to each introduce yourself just briefly, a little bit about yourself, so the audience could connect with us. We could go ladies first, alphabetical order. Felicia.
Morning, I'm Felicia Linch, and I am a governance advisor. I spent many years actually. I'm originally born a child of the diaspora, I would say. I was born in the UK. My mum is from Barbados and my dad is from Nigeria. I spent 20 years living in the Caribbean and working as a governance advisor, particularly to the overseas territories. And I came back to the UK during COVID, which was quite a stretch. And I now continue to work in governance. I have clients still in the Caribbean, but also I do a lot of board work here in the UK with companies, which is interesting to see the dynamics and the differences, or not so many differences between the two.
Thanks, Felicia. Latoya.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Latoya. I'm an attorney at the Anson McCall Group, and until about 3 years ago, I never thought that governance would be an area that I felt so passionately about and that I would end up settling into. But it's such a wide range that we are allowed to get into and to delve into when it comes to how our organizations can successfully and sustainably operate in a way that impacts the world positively. So I'm very happy to be here and to share with you all today.
Thanks, Latoya. Noveck.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Noveck. I've been serving higher ed for close to 20 years. My background is in information systems, information technology, but sort of transitioned over time to leadership and management and culminating in governance. So my research primarily involved IT governance, and the burning question for me at the time was, what are some of the barriers to IT governance adoption in the Caribbean? And through that process, IT governance was really born out of corporate governance principles. So my reading and literature and focus was really around IT governance, but acknowledging the fact that it is a fundamental part of corporate governance. And I'm just happy to be here today to share some of my experiences.
Great, thanks. So welcome again. So coming back to the theme, breaking the status quo in the boardroom. Before we get into it's a very meaty subject, and it could imagine quite a wide array of topics. One of the things I appreciate about this organization, the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute, something that resonated when I first met up with Kamala about a little over a year ago, is given all the issues that plague the region, there's clearly a significant amount of good work happening at all levels: public sector, private sector, the NGOs, policymakers, regional organizations, different sectors, health, tourism, manufacturing. Yet there are a number of issues that plague us individually in the region. We are an amalgam, or rather a group of fragmented islands that still believe that we should just do our own thing. And despite the many, many calls over decades to work together, try to look for those areas of common ground, cooperation, how to create and to utilize the limited resources. And those resources every year we recognize become more and more limited. In the face of growing external issues, whether they are social issues, ecological issues, social, economic, and environmental issues, ecological issues, those calls still keep coming, and I'm not sure if we're getting the kind of traction that is required, which is the beauty about this organization. It brings people from across different sectors across the region who are in leadership positions. We're all in boardrooms of various types, and the anticipation is that given the topics that we actually can come together and start to form those working relationships and connections to move things forward. Because any of us who have worked across the region see the potential, and we consistently wonder, why aren't we doing better? All right. And in my mind, some of the solutions are simple, but because of various reasons, they're difficult to attain. So hopefully these types of sessions will move us towards that. And one of the key things, of course, would be it can't be business as usual, as they say, hence breaking the status quo. So given the fact that we have a governance enthusiast, someone who does not accept status quo typically, and someone who is is quite qualified in the area of governance, do you have any key examples of success stories in breaking the status quo that we could set the tone and share with the audience? I imagine you've been there and done that in some form or fashion. You have anything to share with us that could start inspiring others to do similar? Of course, all towards making a positive difference.
Derek, would it be possible, before we kind of jump in there, maybe to think about what that means, in terms of changing the status quo, what that means, because it can mean different things, right, to different people.
Yes.
Yes. And when I was thinking about this, I thought about it from sort of two perspectives, and I'm sure my colleagues have more. But the first one was where you mentioned this piece around the shift from, business as usual. And so when I think about business as usual, I'm thinking about shareholder primacy and profit maximization, that very short-term financial gain. And then the alternative is, when I think about shifting the status quo, is also about this kind of groupthink that we have that occurs in the boardroom. A lot of our organizations have come up from being family-run businesses. You've still got very much a founder, at the top of the tree. And even if you get the new young generation coming through that want to do something differently, people tend to just follow the pack. There's a lot that goes into that because of our culture. We want to honor people and so on. And so it can be very difficult for people to kind of, decide to go against, the way the founder is voting or wants to go. So those were the two areas that, for me, when I started to think about shifting the status quo, that kind of came to mind. And I don't know if my colleagues want to add to that.
I'm happy to jump in and add. Firstly, I will say both Derek and Felicia have evidently had a peek at my notes for today. But I love the fact that we are all evidently so aligned in terms of our thought process here. One of the things, Felicia, and all of the attendees today, that really stood out to me was the fact that before we can even talk about breaking the status quo, we have to figure out and identify what the status quo is, because what it is varies from organization to organization, territory to territory, and so on. So the status quo in one company may look like, it may present a need to break an ethnic diversity barrier, and another company may struggle in the area of diversity, but it may be related to age. So even when we're speaking about the same area, sometimes there are these distinguishing factors, and in order to fix something, we have to know that it's broken. So I think that would be my initial contribution here.
So I have a very interesting use case here. The Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. Well, I'm sorry to sort of default on going into a very technical organization, but they are the global organization that controls how internet addresses like CCGI.com would map to an IP address. So they allocate the IP addresses as well as the domain names at a very high level. And it was previously a sort of state-controlled function many years ago, I think about 25 years ago. It sort of transitioned into the state handing over to a board, an established statutory body, now to sort of run with this function. And they implemented a model that was very innovative at the time, and it's certainly a very interesting use case today. And they went with something called the bottom-up multi-stakeholder governance model, where there were different advisory committees, different stakeholders at the bottom representing different communities, whether it was at-large interests of the internet end users, whether it was security and stability stakeholders, whether it was governments from around the world, and sort of feeding the advice upwards to the board to implement and control this organization that basically deals with, I think, about $1 billion TT, $1 billion annually. So about 175 million US dollars in revenue, controlling the internet as we know it.
Thank you very much. One of the things that is common in all the responses, as different as they are, is it boils back down to understanding purpose. Because, and of course, I will speak only strictly from my experience. Joining a board, one of the things that tends to, in my mind, be missing is an onboarding, no pun intended. And having sat on boards as a director and sat on boards as reporting to a board in a number of instances, what I've found common over the years is that there's a clear need for anyone serving on a board to understand the organization, literally understand that inside out. And that is not common, which is very surprising to me. Because if you don't understand the organization, then you won't understand the overall, to me, adequately understand its purpose, its operations, its culture, its people, its challenges. And then you roll that up into the actual terms of engagement for the board. Sometimes even that is not reviewed or part of your package. You just jump in and you attend meetings and you go with the flow, so to speak. And that could lead to a number of the points you raise in terms of business as usual, groupthink, bias. And you haven't even gotten into a number of the meatier areas where it could be diversity and inclusion, gender balance, age, experience. Do you have the right people on the board in terms of for the type of organization, and then the organization strategy? To what degree is the board involved in the strategy of the organization, particularly long-term direction? And then, of course, I'm sure this is something very that Noveck is very versed on, is the emerging technosphere in the realm of AI and cybersecurity and overall risk management and mitigation. The board has a significant handful. And when you go back to basics in terms of what is my role, my responsibility as a director, and the seriousness of it. And we haven't even gotten into the meetings, the agendas, subcommittees, and all those various things. So you are absolutely correct, Felicia. You could tackle this thing from many, many different angles.
Thanks very much, Derek. May I just interrupt for 1 minute, please? We would have asked each of the panelists to prepare their thoughts in terms of 8 to 10 minute key points, which we would like them to share, and then we'll come back to this interactive part of the discussion with everyone. So if we could start with Latoya, then go to Felicia, and then Noveck, and then we come back to everyone together. Is that all right?
Perfect.
So Latoya, is that all right with you to start?
Absolutely. So I mean, just taking a step backwards a bit, because I really did spend some time focusing on the theme of regenerative capitalism. And one of the first things that I pulled was a definition, of course. It came out of an interview at the World Economic Forum where Chris Stoker Walker defined regenerative capitalism as business practices that restore and build rather than exploit or destroy. I will be honest, my first reaction was, well, with a definition so vast and so wide, I felt like I didn't get the kind of direction I was looking for as far as pulling a definition. But what I also found is that it gave the perfect launch pad for a discussion like what we are setting up for today, being breaking the status quo in the boardroom. Because boards, as the leaders of organizations to a certain extent, and as the directors of strategy, particularly long-term vision and long-term strategy, they have to evolve as business practice evolves. And that's what regenerative capitalism is calling for. It's calling for the evolution of business practice. We would have spoken about business as usual simply not being good enough in today's day and age, right? And when we speak to breaking the status quo of boards, and we go back to the point that Felicia and I would have raised, in that the status quo looks different in different places, we have to start there. We have to start first by surveying our cultural identity as far as from a national level come down to a company's level. And we have to see how that plays into the status quo in each entity. We would have spoken about the issue of diversity, and I think that we often get sucked into the point of diversity from the things that pop straight to the top of our minds. I'm not going to get too deep into it at this stage, but we need diversity when we think of diversity. We need to not only think of ethnicity, we need to not only think of gender. We need to think of the balance between age and where a company is going, and experience and where a company has come from, right? So that's one of the things that I would love to get feedback from my fellow panelists on, that I would love to continue discussing today. The other thing, in terms of determining what the status quo is before we can change the status quo, is our need to remember that companies, just like people, have personalities. Companies have characteristics, things that have been formed over the practices that have been adopted and maintained year over year. That's what develops the status quo. No two people are the same, and no two companies are the same. When we look at the difference between, let's say, industries, so we talk about the oil and gas industry versus, let's say, an NGO or non-profit organization, what the focus may need to be as far as environmental impacts in an energy entity may look like a need to focus on financial stewardship and financial governance in an NGO. And that just comes back to us recognizing that governance at both a management and board level is not a one-size-fits-all. When I think of breaking the status quo, one of the other phrases that immediately came to my mind was breaking the glass ceiling. So I did a little bit of research, right? And this is a term that was coined in 1978 by Marilyn Loden. Most of us would know that breaking the glass ceiling would have been used when women were now entering the workplace as a means of discussing how women intended to find their place, right? I think we can take an example from looking at the progress that has been made as far as breaking the glass ceiling. The glass ceiling has not been shattered overnight. It took time. The progress has been slow, but it has been impactful. And I think that's the same kind of journey we need to be prepared for when we talk about breaking the status quo in the boardroom. It's not going to happen overnight. It is going to take a lot of work, but if we dedicate ourselves to it, it's going to push forward impactful change for what it means to operate as a business and a company. Earlier today in panel 1, and I believe in Cecile's message this morning, although I wasn't able to make that session, there was a discussion around how we get our boards to line up with what we need from them right now. And I believe Cecile may have referenced board evaluations and using these different types of tools for this purpose. So I want to touch on that for a little bit. Board evaluations tend to measure the effectiveness of a board, and that's very important information to have. But I would like to go a step further and talk about skills matrices and peer evaluations and how we can use these to identify gaps that exist. When we see those gaps, we can then work towards filling them. We can work towards succession planning at a board level. So many organizations focus on succession planning as an HR function in order to have the right persons ready to ascend to management. And so often we see, I think particularly in Caribbean society, that we have a pool of directors almost, right? So there are a pool of experts within the markets that tend to shuffle between boards. And while there's a place for that, because we need to balance expertise with fresh ideas, it can also end up being a hindrance to an organization's progress, right? I mean, here at Anson McCall, we do board evaluations on an annual basis. Every single year, board evaluation is done. We check to see whether we are still meeting the skill sets that we need for our board to govern the organization. In the event that anyone is not aware of what the Anson McCall Group does, we're a conglomerate within the Caribbean, and we operate in about 10 industries. So sitting at what we call our parent board is no easy task. We really have to carefully construct and compose our board to ensure that we have the right level of expertise to govern the organization. And I think that just to tie it back to the fact that we do need to look at a tailored approach when we talk about breaking the status quo. I also spent a lot of time, and this is more in thinking rather than researching, in terms of Professor Eldrick's book, People, Planet, and Profit, right? And in thinking of the triple bottom line, I think, one, it's a term that people are now becoming more familiar with, but it's a term that he coined 30 years ago, I believe, about 30 years ago. And what I thought of is that people aspect of it. The first point being that I don't think people come first by mistake, right? And when we think of our directors as people in their individual capacity, we can think of their characteristics. Their characteristics are what flow into the board's characteristics. The board's characteristics are then reflected in the company. And I think two important characteristics that I would like to highlight would be willingness to learn and ability to adapt, right? The willingness to learn speaks to the attitude of each director, which is then going to reflect in the attitude of the board. And the ability to adapt speaks to knowing where the weaknesses are, admitting that, and setting things like training agendas that are going to plug those gaps in order to drive the organization's agenda forward. Right? So as I close out, I know that earlier today, I believe it was Sandra Osborne who spoke about value creation. And what I want to tie in with why it's important that we focus on breaking the status quo in the boardroom is because I believe that value creation in 2024, from the perspective of our external stakeholders particularly, looks a lot different than value creation may have looked like 50 years ago. I think we now have shareholders and stakeholders who sincerely care about more than simply the dollar value that they're getting out of a company. I think that we are dealing with generations that are looking at the world around them and they are seeking to implement change. And in an environment where it's so easy to feel powerless as an individual, people are going to look towards where they are invested to see that that change is being pushed forward. Thank you, Kamala. Thank you.
Thanks, Latoya. Quite a significant contribution. You've touched on a number of different things there, and I've taken some notes to respond, but just to not delay, we'll move straight on to, I think it's Felicia next. Yes, please, and then we could, but very interesting points you made there. Thank you.
Latoya, thank you. As you said, I think we've both been cribbing from each other's notes. You did your end point about value creation is really helpful because that's kind of what I want to speak about. So we talked about this shift, and I said it could be in two ways. It could be around the cultural piece and the groupthink, and a lot of that you've shared and spoken about, particularly because I think diversity has a lot to do with that and making that cultural shift in a mindset shift. But I think so where I'll focus on is around that shareholder primacy and short-term financial gain. I do think that we have a new generation of leaders that are coming up that actually think and want more than just that. But we still have in those positions, you talked about that pool of people that kind of just keep getting circulated in our societies and that keep turning up on the boards. And as long as we have that, then we still have that tendency towards this short-term financial gain and shareholder primacy. And I think one of the big ways in which we can break that is firstly by asking, as you did, is what do we mean then if we say we want to move from that? What do we want to move to? Because I think that's the big difficulty, is that if we are not very clear about defining that, then it makes it very difficult for a board to know the direction of travel. And I like you, I was thinking around this concept of, well, what is regenerative capitalism? And the definitions are very wide. And Professor Elkington yesterday said, and so did so many of our speakers, that actually it's an oxymoron, regenerative capitalism. And so I'm thinking about it in terms of regenerative business models, because you talked just a moment ago about value creation, and our business model drives that value creation. Yeah. And so one of the things that I recognize is that when we think about value creation, i.e. what value do we create? I think there's two things. One, who are we creating value for? We now need to be in a position where we're no longer just thinking about creating value for shareholders, but for all stakeholders. So that looks like our suppliers, our customers, our clients, and so on. You know, even our government stakeholders, you know, our regulators, and so on. And so that's a piece that the board needs to start thinking about, that sort of stakeholder governance. The second area where I think we need to start thinking about our business model and value creation is how we create that value. So what do we do in order to get those outputs, to develop that product or that service? And traditionally, with a sort of business as usual mentality, all we've thought about is our financial inputs. And one of the things that I quite like is the IIRC, which they're using what they call the 6 capitals. And so the IIRC this is the International Integrated Reporting Council, and they have 6 capitals. So they look at financial capital. So that's, you know, how we put money into the business for it to grow. They look at manufactured capital. So what are the physical assets and things that we use in order to develop the product or service? Intellectual capital. So that's the organizational knowledge. They look at human capital, that's our people, their competencies, you know, abilities, skills, knowledge, etc. Social and relational capital, where are we making those relationships and those connections and networks that help our business? And then lastly, the natural capital. And so that's obviously our natural resources, knowing that our natural resources are not finite, rather, and not, you know, there in perpetuity, as we're seeing with oil and gas and all of the rest of it. And so if a board is only looking at how it creates value through the lens of financial capital and doesn't look at these other things, then there's no way it can assess whether that business model is extractive, let's put it that, you know, and depleting the resources, or whether it's degenerative, before they can even start thinking about what does it look like to be regenerative. So we need, therefore, to give the board tools and training so that they know what a business model for the future needs to look like, and they can make you know, an informed decision as to, okay, this is what we're doing now, this is how our business model is, you know, is creating value now. Are we going to stick with that? And what's the consequences of us sticking with that, from a reputational risk, from legal risks in terms of compliance and the way policy and regulation is changing? You know, what's the risk in terms of economic you know, risks? Because if we continue, I'll give an example. I do a lot of work in the agricultural sector, and with fertilizers and things like that have gotten quite a bad reputation. You know, they're being put into the category of pesticides and so on, and damaging to the earth and our water course and all of the rest of it. And so one of my clients manufactures fertilizers, and the question then that we ask is, okay, that might be fine now, the way we're doing things and the processes, but in 5 years, 10 years time, when the regulation has shifted, when people's attitudes and consumer attitudes are changing, and they want to see a more green and environmentally friendly, you know, approach, are we going to have a business model that's sustainable, you know, economically viable? So that's when we then start looking at, well, how do we create value? And is there a different or a better way of doing it that is regenerative, that is green? And I think these are the questions that boards need to start asking, but they need to have, as Derek said, they need to have the training, not just induction, but they need to have the training to be forensic in being able to make those decisions and the tools to help them. And what's interesting, I think, for me, you know, in sort of summing up with that, is that when was it Rosalie spoke yesterday and about the survey, it was really interesting to see the statistics that, you know, less than 10% of the board would say that they're very good on the whole ESG piece. And that was in 2022. That hasn't changed. 50% of them say that they know it's important, but less than 10% say they actually are very well informed about what that means and what they should do with it. So if they can't even think about it in terms of the impacts and so on, they're looking at their business and they're not regularly reviewing it, then how do we get them to the point of then looking at, how should I shift my business model to be regenerative? So I think there's quite a bit of work to be done in that space. And I think the other thing that I would say is that one of the ways in which we've been trying to shift it is to talk about values and to talk about purpose. So you've got entities like the B Corp movement that tries to get people to focus on being well, they do more than actually focus on being a purpose-driven business, because what they ask is that if you are going to commit to B Corp, then you, within your articles, so enshrining it in your governance mechanism, you have to put that you are going to take account of more than just shareholder value. So you have to make a commitment to all stakeholders' value creation. And I think that's a great method. But as we see, B Corp, there's only a fraction of them across the globe. And we don't yet have a B Lab in the Caribbean. So I think, you know, the ways in which we can help move this and make this shift are things like the corporate governance code. And what's been great is to see, for example, in the Trinidad code, we now have the draft 2024. They've put sustainability in there, and it's very clear, you know, that they're starting to look at that. And I think those will start to compel the changes in the boardroom and help break the status quo. But again, there's still a lot of work to be done on the cultural piece. And I think that I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Felicia. I see no repetition at all with what Latoya said. I think you've added significantly to the content here for us to discuss. So we'll go straight to Noveck.
Right,
Thanks.
so I think there's a little bit of overlap between Latoya and Felicia's, but not significant. So I want to start with the theme of this conference on regenerative capitalism. And essentially, it's a concept of sustainable creation instead of exploitative destruction. And it was summarized really well in Professor Elkington's slide yesterday on the transition from shareholder value to system value, which sort of illustrated the evolving relationship between business, society, and the environment. And yesterday, that really stood out to me, how much the environment really dominated the discourse, both during the keynote as well as the panel discussions. So if we consider the same systems value model that Professor Elkington shared yesterday with the business operating within the society and the society within the environment, I want to really focus on the environmental or external factors that would flow the other way and exert tremendous pressure on organizations rather than organizations, you know, sort of contributing towards the environment. So drawing some parallels here to the system value model, cybersecurity falls within the scope of IT governance, which in itself is a subset of corporate governance. And one of the most common misconceptions out in the wild, I would say, is that IT governance and all the associated domains is an IT issue. It is not. It is fundamentally a corporate governance issue in how IT supports and enables the business. But today I really want to discuss the industrialization of cybercrime and how board diversity can help boards prepare for and mitigate this existential threat. Now, I consider it an existential threat because over the last 7 years, global cybercrime costs have exploded from $70 billion annually to over $8 trillion annually, which is an 11,000% increase over the period. And this figure includes the cost both to prevent and to respond to cybercrime. But on the prevention side, in 2023 alone, just 1% of that $8 trillion was spent on prevention, and the other 99% was spent on the response and the fallout to cybercrime. So to put things in perspective, in 2023 alone, that 99% of $8 trillion would have been spent on losses due to stolen money, damage or destruction of data, intellectual property theft, data breaches, business interruptions, and one of the most hardest to quantify, I think, would have been reputational harm to the organization. And it's interesting to know that all of these implications fall under the oversight of the board. So my question to everyone here today is, are your boards sufficiently prepared to handle this threat? And in the cybersecurity world, there's this expression, not if, but when. As protector of the shareholder interests and having oversight of management and direction of the organization, as well as being accountable for the legal and regulatory compliance, it is fundamentally the board's responsibility to take oversight and have ownership of cybersecurity risks, including the risk appetite of the individual organization, to sort of prioritize cybersecurity and set the tone for management and the executive to either establish a culture or change the culture of cybersecurity throughout the organization. It is the board's responsibility to ensure that a robust cybersecurity and IT governance framework is in place, which would include policies, procedures, controls, and periodic review. It is the board's responsibility to ensure legal and regulatory compliance, to own business continuity, disaster recovery, incident response and recovery programs, as well as to sort of oversee communication strategies for stakeholders, shareholders, to control the narrative when an event occurs. So to sort of narrow the discussion into the sub-theme of breaking the status quo, I would issue a challenge again to everyone here. Does your board have the diversity to bring this level of insight to disrupt conventional thinking? So last week, Kamala and I had this really engaging chat on this particular topic during our Governance Live event, where we went into much more detail than I could go here, and maybe we can share that link in the chat. But one part of the discussion, we touched on the concept of sort of reviewing or enhancing current governance structures to allow for the use of advisory boards or advisory committees that can focus on specific issues or narratives. So the composition of these advisory boards or committees can comprise of current board members, independent consultants or experts in the field, as well as potential board members. Now, this would accomplish two different things. So diverse opinions and insights into a particular issue such as cybercrime, but also to identify future board members through hands-on engagement and collaboration. So this mechanism, although I'm referring to cybercrime or cybersecurity here, it could be abstracted for any desired competency on the board and can serve as a means of board refreshment or renewal. And the reality is that there's always some degree of misalignment between the board and the executive. Even in organizations with mature IT governance models where the CIO would have a seat on the board, which I don't know how common is across the CCGI represented organizations, I would still encourage the approach of an advisory committee or an advisory board with independent and diverse mindsets. So at a very, very high level, I think there are some challenges to board diversity that is overlapping in the literature, primarily the lack of turnover on the boards, which Latoya and Felicia would have touched on, sort of deficient recruitment policies and procedures, and lack of annual evaluation of board members. So some of these strategies that were suggested to sort of strengthen board diversity would be to look at the current composition of the board, identify gaps based on the internal metrics as well as external forces and remediate, to bolster the refreshment plan with policies that look at things like term limits, mandatory retirement ages, and peer assessments to replace under-engaged board members. I would have touched on the reviewing the governance structures to allow for the use of advisory boards or advisory committees, rotation of roles to ensure strategic committee leadership that would evolve as the environment changes, because the environment is constantly changing, and to sort of build in diversity into succession planning at the board level, and to build diversity into the core governance framework of these organizations. So to sort of summarize my thoughts and bring this point to conclusion, I think I'd like to issue a call to action for the organizations represented here to sort of evaluate and enhance your board diversity, to establish a cybersecurity advisory committee if you haven't one already, for the board to take ownership and set the tone for cybersecurity at the very top, and give the executive a mandate to embed this position, this posture into the core organizational culture, and to engage all stakeholders to ensure that strategy is aligned with actions. So again, just thanks for the opportunity to share, and I think I'll pass this back over to Derek.
Thanks, Noveck. Significant points to consider. So with all that Latoya, Felicia, and Noveck had to contribute to see how we could now map it together, because it's one of the interesting points Latoya brought up was that boards need to evolve. No doubt about that. At various stages, some are already quite evolved. Some need some work. I mean, we have a gamut across the region. At the same time, to Noveck's point, that call to action, there is a sense of urgency, because under the broad theme of regenerative capitalism, there's no doubt that the region faces several types of crises currently, and there are looming crises as well. So I don't believe that we have the luxury of a slow evolution. We're going to have certainly some fundamental things change as soon as possible. And given the range of issues that we're talking about, what are those priorities? And how do we get the boards? How do boards themselves, who are charged? One of the key things that came out of Latoya's points that resonated to me was leadership. Leadership in at the level of not just the organization, because one of the things that I point out when I'm having discussions around circular economy is one of the key areas, this key status quo that I see is that most companies operate only within its borders. It only looks at its business, even at the level of the board. And the feeling is that once you walk out of that meeting room or you walk out of the office, that's it. That is not true. We live in the society, we live in the environment, we live in the economy. So therefore, why aren't those things intimately intertwined with all the other key stakeholders? You can't cover all stakeholders. Why aren't we engaging, especially at the level of the board, at that level of leadership, which then which connects to something Felicia was saying? We expect the board, regardless of age, gender, background, we expect them to possess the level of wisdom, whether they have it themselves or they can attain it, to be able to guide the organization forward. Imagine all these companies and entities being ships in the ocean. We're still in the same ocean. Why is it that we don't go beyond the borders of our business, as I'm fond of saying, and engage? And I'm speaking right now from the perspective from where I work. We are doing some strat planning, and it is almost as if it's the first time the organization is actually talking to some of its key stakeholders. It's like, wow. And it, which goes back to my earlier point, some of the solutions we're looking at are very simple and they're right in front of us. And in many cases, if you look back at I think it was Latoya who mentioned it. Where have we come from? What has worked in the past? So I don't believe it's complex, but it does require that change in status quo, whatever form it takes, including advisory boards, including reference to standards, codes. I mean, we have people in the audience who have been instrumental in developing the recent ISO standards for organization of governance of organizations, ISO 37000. There's several reference points, guidelines, and many experts. So breaking the status quo, I mean, we can generalize that, but I think given the topic of Governance Week, how do we deal with this triple crises that we have? It being social, environmental, and economic, and many of I would argue that quite a lot of it is intertwined. So given all that, I mean, we could sit here for hours, right? I mean, Noveck's point around cybersecurity is significant, but it also translates into overall company risk management. How do we steer these ships through clearly what is going to be choppy water, storms, and all these various things? How do we, and why are we trying to do it alone in our separate organizations, and even separate countries? That defies logic to me. So opening up back the floor, how can we, in the little time we have here, move forward? That this call to action that Noveck mentioned, how do we actually have this start to materialize, come out of this session? How do we inspire and encourage the audience and the membership to actually make the changes that are required, whatever form they take? Because I think it was Latoya's point, it has to be tailored.
Yes.
It has to be tailored to the specific organizations and the specific situations and boards. But how do we now, as a panel, break beyond the typical status quo of how these things are approached, which is usually in silos?
So I can start if that's not a problem. So I think we could address the challenge, and I'm just thinking cybersecurity here as the area of interest, right? Statistically speaking, there's research that would list some of the industries that are under threat. And Kamala and I went into that list of 10, that top 10. And I think that would represent everyone in the room here today. So again, we're going back to the point that it's not a matter of if, but when. Your organization already has a countdown timer associated when you are going to be the victim of a critical or severe cyber attack. So to get this discussion rolling, acknowledging that each organization is different, we can go to what Latoya raised and look at the skills matrix of the board. Can the board have this level of conversation independently of the executive? And I'm putting emphasis here. The case study I want to bring forward is the National Telecommunications Company in the Twin Island Republic that I'm not going to specify much more, but there was a very clear gap between the board and the executive. They were clearly speaking different languages. And I don't know if the board had the proper representation to deal with the situation. Now, fundamentally, they were accountable, but there were some, what I considered IT governance failures, IT governance red flags, into how the situation unfolded, the organizational response to it, and the fact that they were there in the first place because the board approved spending on infrastructure, on equipment, on platforms that was not utilized. So again, I'm going back now to the point where if we address the composition of the board to ensure that the board has the capability to have this discussion independently of what the executive is telling them, then that's a good start. So I think the start there is to look at the competencies of the board, ensure that the boards have this level of competence to start the discussion, and then take it from there.
Excellent point. I fully agree. And there's again the use of code standards to apply this. Now we just hope that they would have the professional maturity and that egos could be put aside and the actual value creation and risk management of the organization could take priority over other considerations. Again, depending on the kind of board we're talking about. Thanks, Noveck. Latoya, Felicia?
Latoya, go ahead, because I know you had.
So, well, I actually want to touch, Derek, on the point you raised around simplicity, right? I think some of these solutions are indeed inherently simple. And one of those is just don't reinvent the wheel, right? There's a lot that is yet to be adopted in the Caribbean. And I think sometimes, especially because, in islands, you have one, two, maybe, in an island like Trinidad, we have maybe 5 or 6 very large organizations that can truly lean on each other and that sort of thing. And I think that there's often an element of shame in adaptation when someone else does it well. And I think that that's something that boards can learn to release. Right? I think just we can look internationally to pull from best practice. That is something that we would have done and continue to do even in adopting the update to the corporate governance code in 2024. We don't always have to start from scratch in order to achieve something impactful. And I think that there's a lot of power in recognizing that. And Noveck, also in your substantive presentation, you spoke to policies and procedures. And I think that's the other area where we can speak, again, not reinventing the wheel, but sometimes putting something down on paper and saying, this is the standard that we are setting for this organization is the wake-up call that everyone needs. And I will speak from my experience here at Anson McCall. Those discussions are often very fruitful. Someone simply raising a hand to say, maybe we should look at deepening our risk maturity. Maybe we should start to measure, track, and report on ESG, not because it's yet become regulated, but because we can't call ourselves best in class if we don't look internationally at best in class, see what is being done, adapt it to ourselves, even if we have to accept that we might not meet European standards immediately. We are going beyond compliance, whatever that might mean to us right now. And as we just pick a starting point and embrace simplicity and just taking the first step, I think we'll continue to see a lot of positive things unfolding in the area of governance, and by extension, the status quo is going to start to shift.
Thanks, Latoya. And before you go, Felicia, there's something that both Latoya and Noveck said that that resonated, in that culturally, regionally, we have a Caribbean culture that it has, like anything else, its pros and cons. One of the things that we as a region, and it goes even beyond the Caribbean, seem to struggle with, and I think it's rooted in governance, and decision making and alignment, is accountability. Now, I have found that at all levels, I've worked with very large organizations, small organizations, public sector, private sector, and accountability seems to be one of the most evasive things I've encountered at all levels of the organization. That either it's apprehension or ignorance, or it's just unwillingness to even go down that road. Yet when applying some sort of framework and structure and standards and codes, that becomes part of it, it's embedded. And that maturity needs, well, we say needs to happen. How do we make it happen? I think is what we're trying to get at here as well. Because back to the simplicity point, the fundamentals are still the same in relation to governance, accountability, transparency, and so on and so forth. So just wanted to add that. Felicia?
Thank you for that. That actually is really helpful, in the sense that I've been reflecting and listening to what we were saying, and a lot of what came out of the last panel was the fact that it's really important for us to have the codes, it's important for us to have the standards and the policies, but we can put in as much as we like, and if people choose to ignore it because they don't want to be held accountable, then it really doesn't make any difference. So it goes back to then, what is the big kind of ticket item? And it's what you said at the beginning, it's leadership. And I think it's really important that we don't sort of relegate that to kind of the executive, but actually it's leadership of the chairman. As the chairman comes in, they need to be somebody who can be the conductor, who can be good at pulling, different perspectives, who can be somebody who orchestrates, rather than sort of what we traditionally have is somebody who leads and is out there in front. Latoya, you mentioned CLECO, and one of the issues that went wrong with CLECO was the fact that the chairman was fairly dogmatic. He was also the CEO, and yes, some of our codes now, for example, have made sure that there's a division of responsibilities. But the fact of the matter is, when you have a very strong personality like that, who doesn't lead, doesn't really have leadership, modern leadership skills, what you're going to get is everybody just going down with them and the status quo being embedded. So I think leadership is really key, and how we recruit and who we recruit is key. And I guess the question I would ask is really not just about what skills do we need, because we get really great skills, in my experience on the boards in the Caribbean, we have great subject matter experts. What we don't have are people who necessarily understand their role and their fiduciary duty as a director. And I think that's the key, is how do we equip them to understand that they're not coming in as subject matter experts? Yes, it's great if they bring that with them, but what we want from them is to have that leadership that says, okay, I'm going to be forensic, I'm going to challenge, I'm going to have that oversight and accountability and that strategic understanding, and come up a level, frankly, not be down here in the operational things, trying to tell the senior management team how to do it and what to do, because we get a lot of that, but to stay up here and be the ones that challenge, be the ones that set, set the direction and so on. And so I think one of the key ways of doing it is around that diversity in the board, and having that fundamental look at crafting your board, not just inviting your friends and whoever else, but you have to craft your board and be intentional. And you craft the board on the basis of where's the organization headed? What's the future of the organization? And build your board for the future rather than building your board just for today or for what you did in the past.
Agreed.
Derek, if
And
I may add really
yes,
quickly, and not so
please.
much add,
Yeah.
but there's a very vivid image that came to my mind while Felicia described what I would say is the perfect role of a chairman. And that is not dictatorship. What it really is kind of like the conductor of a symphony. So someone who is willing to take a step back from being heard long enough to direct conversation and allow the feeding of one area of expertise off of another in a way that comes together to really create a gelled board that can advance an organization's agenda. You put it beautifully, Felicia.
Agreed.
One of the common themes that I'm hearing on this panel and the panel before is the issue of culture. Now, this is where I spent the better part of the last 8 years looking at the phenomenon of organizational culture. And my research basically found that culture has an impact on IT governance, the implementation of IT governance. But because it inherits properties of corporate governance, culture can also impact how organizations are governed. Now, culture is not immutable. Culture can be changed, but it goes to leadership. You need the right people leading the charge to try to change culture. And it's not something that can just happen overnight. So like, for example, if you're looking to implement a formal IT governance framework, whether it's the ISO 38500, whether it's COBIT, the first step I think should be to sort of look at the culture of the organization and how it would react to changes of this magnitude. And then if the culture needs to change before you implement this framework, put steps in place. Otherwise, you're just sort of building on a shaky foundation and shooting yourself in the foot. And another thing I would have observed through just general literature on organizations is that some organizations sort of cherry pick approaches from different frameworks. Now, the downside to that is it's very difficult to measure how effective it would be if you're taking bits and pieces of different frameworks. Each framework would have its measures of efficiency, but by borrowing attributes of different models, different frameworks, different contexts, you may satisfy checking some boxes to say we did this, but it's very difficult to measure. So what happens is that the efficiency, the effectiveness isn't necessarily reviewed. And I think, one takeaway from this is that depending on the size, the scale of the organization, definitely take a look at a framework, a formal framework, rather than sort of cherry picking. And again, I'm going back to what Latoya said in that one size doesn't fit all. This isn't a cookie cutter approach. You really need to look at the size, the scope, the level of complexity that the organization is willing to entertain. And then, and I'm seeing a point in the chat where change management frameworks are subjective. I agree, but a change management framework may be needed to sort of transition the organization from now to the future. So it's a good idea to look at a change management framework as well.
One of the benefits of using systems, and I know that it's not all systems, is it's subjecting your company, or less in this case, the board's operations, structure, etc., to third-party scrutiny, right? Yes. Against standards. And that's the key thing, as opposed to trying to the point that Avia made, is we are human beings. There will always be subjectivity, but you want to reduce that to a manageable level and make sure the balance of the level of objectivity is strong against agreed standards, whatever standards are chosen or selected by the organization. But so you come back now to making those decisions. So, and you go back to all the points that you all have raised: composition of the board, leadership, ensuring that they understand not just only their business and their industry, but how the industry now sits in terms of the overall national and then regional and international development and all the different things that are taking place. So coming back to the simplicity, breaking status quo requires courage, right? Who is going to take that step if there's going to be one or more? What happens inside the boardroom, so to speak? Are we relying only on the chairman, chairwoman, the corp sec? Who is going to make that? How does that happen? The dynamics in terms of creating that level of discomfort that, unless everything is perfect, which I don't think there are much, if any, organizations that operate like that. And again, if boards are meant to operate at that higher strategic, big picture, long-term level, you will always be uncomfortable. So in that state of discomfort, how do we start to then move from an organization? I think Noveck would have alluded to that, the reactivity behind something like cybersecurity. That's very real, but it's not only cybersecurity. You have many things that are fundamental, that we still have quite a bit of reactivity taking place in the world of HSC, fiscal management, and so on and so forth. You have quite a number of issues still, as opposed to, again, operating at the level of board where the intention is to move it towards preemptive, not even proactive. So how do we put our heads together, and what can, to Noveck's call for action, where do we go from here? What has to happen? We've spoken about, so we've spoken about a number of solutions. What are some of the other key things we can do? Sorry, Felicia.
I think one of the big things is, I love what Noveck said about, what we really want to change the status quo is disruption. That's what you always want. You want to put something in there that lights a fire and frankly blows everything up in a constructive way. And one of the best ways of doing that is to have those naysayers in the room. Too few boards, though, are going to invite a naysayer, somebody who's typically a challenge to them, into the boardroom. But a board that is really future focused and really wants to make a difference will do that. And one of the ways that they can do that is exactly what Noveck has just had talked about, alluded to, about having these working groups or advisory committees. Some organizations are now starting to, as we start to talk about this moving from the business as usual, shareholder focus, shareholder primacy, are starting to put in place customer groups or what they call stakeholder groups. And they will deliberately invite people who they know, especially around the green agenda. They will deliberately invite people who they know are fairly have a different perspective to them on these issues, because the issue for a company is you don't want to be at a distance from those things. You want to hear that voice and understand where they're coming from, so that you can then start to either address it or, by changing to a more regenerative model of business, or by saying, you know what, actually, you're not quite right, and being able to defend the narrative that is out there, right? But if you don't hear the voice and you don't force yourself to come face to face with some of those challenges, and break that status quo of the way you think. So one of those issues is around cognitive diversity, then you will never get anywhere. So I really am a firm believer in putting together these stakeholder groups for boards, to interact with and to actually hear for themselves, what the challenges are, is a really powerful way of being able to break the status quo.
Agreed. Just open yourself up to that. Be comfortable to get constructive criticism. Allow challenge. Put the egos aside. Open your mind. Open your ears. And just one last thing, as Charlene put, as in terms of a compass, because what you're trying to do is to engage with even your competition, I would argue, right? And reduce uncertainty. Actually start to put more emphasis on common benefits and common value creation, not only about, because I believe, coming back to an earlier point, one of the limitations is if you put blinders on, you will not have a clear line of sight forward. You will not see the total picture because you're so super focused only on your company, your business, and not enough on the bigger picture, and the fact that we operate as entities in the global, national, and regional and international social spaces, economic spaces, and of clearly the environmental spaces. So again, to me, these things, they're common sense, but we struggle with that. Yes, Latoya?
Yeah, so I was just going to add, apart from the stakeholder consultative groups that Felicia is referencing, which I think hold great value that organizations can pull from, I think a good stepping stone toward that is actually just increasing the independence on our boards. And when we say independence, we mean true independence. So I know not every company may have an independence policy in place. I will give an example simply because the company I am at does. No one who has had a salary being drawn by consultancy, etc., out of our group is considered independent for a period of 3 clear years.
Yeah.
Right? And that's because we need to be sure that when we bring expertise into the room, we're also bringing them in with a certain level of chutzpah. They need to be willing to oppose the chairman if he is incorrect on an issue. They need to have the understanding that within the boardroom, the fiduciary duty does stand out. That is the primary function. It's not about a friendship. It's not about maintaining a relationship. The relationship we maintain at that point is with our stakeholders, both internal and external. And I think when directors are truly independent, they show up powerfully in that space.
Yes.
And to go back to one of the things Noveck said, and it just came out from Felicia again, one of the things that we've implemented in our governance structure actually are advisory councils, right? And that is because for the structure of our company, where it is largely one shareholder for a lot of our subsidiaries, you don't want groupthink. Groupthink is how you crash a business. So you need to have people who are, to a certain extent, disconnected from you. And I use the term disconnected just to express the level of independence you really do want to search for, to give you their sincere thoughts on the direction you say that you're trying to go in, and their sincere thoughts on whether that can even work.
So to sort of simplify what Latoya and Felicia was saying, I think you need someone in the room to ask difficult and uncomfortable questions. So if you don't have difficult and uncomfortable questions happening, you need to change the room, because the people in the room will just be agreeing among themselves and maintaining the status quo. So you can't challenge the status quo unless you have, again, it could be the consulted groups, it could be independent directors, but you need to have someone in there asking difficult questions and uncomfortable questions for change.
Agreed. And
So, Derek, if I may just interrupt for 1 more minute to remind the participants that they do have an opportunity for Q&A, so that they can also be involved in the conversation. And if it's okay, I wanted to ask Jada Arthur, if it's Jada, forgive me, I'm not too clear on the pronunciation. She had this really good comment earlier about the disconnect between the board and technology initiatives. So Jada, is it possible for you to unmute and share with us as well so we can hear your thoughts?
Yes, thank you. When I think about breaking the status quo, I think it largely depends on technology. That is the view I saw it from. So when I think about technology, I think about, culture and the way in which a board is able to operate. So from this instance, I thought about things like digital voting, virtual hybrid meetings, and informative and a new way of actually having minutes recorded. And I think this will come from a board that is a bit open, bit understanding, and they have that ability to think forward, to be forward thinking and not being left behind. Because sometimes when we think about board composition, we think about a group of high level executives sitting in one room, having a annual meeting, making decisions. And I think we have moved greatly beyond that. So now to simplify the wheel and, not to reinvent the wheel, I think the role of technology plays a huge part in terms of board composition and board management. And what we also need is a forward thinking panel of forward-thinking board members. So this also really ties it back into culture and how much culture really plays a big part in terms of the diversity and the forward thinking of board management. Yes, thank you.
Thanks so much, Jada.
And if I could respond, that it's an interesting point because it goes even beyond the board where technology is concerned. Even the average company still struggles with understanding IT. And the whole issue of cybersecurity, as Noveck pointed out, is not an IT problem, just like anything to do with hardware, software, networking is considered an IT problem. It's an organizational issue. And from my understanding, having we're conducting a cybersecurity risk assessment and looking at standards. The number one risk in cybersecurity is the user, which is each employee, yes, including the board, by the way, right? So understanding it as an organization and to the earlier point that was being made is important from the inside out. The board is tip of the, well, one could argue a base of the foundation or tip of the spear, whichever way you want to look at it. But the entire organization needs to be aligned. And that general level of understanding what we're about and where we're going, to the earlier point in terms of direction, could set the stage for the issues around governance and transparency, direction, strategy, risk mitigation, and of course, more and more ICT issues are coming to the fore. But again, just to endorse what Noveck is saying, they're not separate from us. They're all part of the organizational challenges growing organizational challenges that we have.
Mm-hmm. And I agree with that overall, Derek, but one of the very powerful points made during this panel discussion has been when you come to where exactly you need to go to break the status quo. And it is the individual director. It is their belief, their thoughts, their behaviors, and whether it's their willingness for continuous education, so they prepare themselves for the new challenges facing the current world, or even how they are prepared to receive some of the constructive feedback that you have shared here is so necessary. And Jada mentioned it too just now when she spoke about having persons, and Noveck too, you have to have this person or persons in the room who are prepared to ask the difficult and uncomfortable questions. That's one side of it. The other side is the persons receiving it, the directors in the room. How prepared are you to face and accept the difficult and uncomfortable questions? And it takes us to that culture issue that is the biggest challenge for us in the region. How do we give feedback? How do we receive feedback? How do we manage the board behavior and board conflicts? So if there is any thoughts or advice from persons on this panel, because that's going to be the key issue to breaking the status quo. How do we change individual directors so that we could change mindsets and begin to create the new culture?
Kamala, I would love to jump in here. I think it comes back down to purpose. And I think Felicia would have mentioned it in her substantive presentation briefly. And I say it comes down to purpose from personal experience. So a few years ago, Ansel McCall would have gone into this process of defining our purpose, right? And our purpose is inspiring better choices for a better world. And I think when that was taken to the board, and the board, when it was proposed to the board and the point was made, I believe by Sandra Osborne earlier, that management recommends, the board approves, right? So one, you have to have a strong base in management. You have to have people who are in this every day who can make a recommendation, right? But when it gets to the board has to buy into what management is saying, or openly discuss if they think there's a change in direction needed. But I'm speaking from buying in because that's what we received. So when the board strongly supports and aligns behind the purpose of a company, everything starts shifting beneath that, right? And if we say, okay, if we show up and our directors are showing up on the basis that they believe that what we do has as its core function the purpose of inspiring better choices for a better world, we first need to make better choices before we can inspire them. And I think it's finding that center. Simon Sinek, an author that I really like, has his entire concept of starting with why, right? And that why is what purpose for a company looks like. So I think that has to be the starting point, and everything feeds into that. That has informed our ESG framework being built out, and our ERM framework. Sorry, I'm using the abbreviations, but let me say environmental, social, and governance framework that was built out and that we since won, I think 2, maybe 3 awards for. And the ERM framework, which is enterprise risk management, that has been deployed. That came out of our board saying, how do we inspire better choices for a better world? What is required of us in order to do this? And that aligned us back to looking for those international examples, seeing where industries were going, and then saying, okay, we may not be skilled in this yet. And that's where I will say corporate secretaries come in, because corporate secretaries assist with the driving of a board's agenda. And when you have a strong corporate secretary who is willing to stand and drive that agenda forward, training can be put in place when a gap is identified. And that training can then lead to implementation of solutions. They may be in the form of policies, they may be in the form of behaviors, but directors at that point can very much realize whether they align with what an organization is for or not. And I think when we focus on that alignment to purpose, a lot of problems get solved. Maybe not immediately, but the solutions start to appear.
If I could just jump in, I'm totally in agreement with that. And it's interesting because that's the reason why, if you look at the ISO 37000, the governance for organizations, at the center is purpose. And they're very clear that that's the foundational principle. And that the purpose needs to be, because, the purpose needs to be beyond money. The idea is that it has to be meaningful and relevant, and that's meaningful to all stakeholders. And I think that one of the big things that, Latoya was just alluding to is that when you have that purpose articulated, it's your North Star, everything that aligns to that. And also, even in the ISO 37000, one of the things that they talk about is, and this goes, Kamala, to your point about mindset and how do you change the individual mindset, is that they say aligned with your purpose, you need to then have a framework of values. And it's the values piece that drives how we walk out that purpose. And it's the values piece that helps you then to say, have we got the right people? And are they the people who, it's hearts and minds stuff, right? Are these the people who are going to operate, and be the gatekeepers and hold us accountable to this purpose? And values do that. And I think that's where we're often lacking, is that the values sort of get developed lower down in the organization, in HR, and they never see the light of day at the board. Or if they do get up to the board just sort of sign them off and think, well, what do I do with that? But it should be the board that drives values, is creating that culture in the boardroom and modeling it for the rest of the organization.
So I just,
I'm sorry,
before,
Noveck, if I may, sorry to cut you. I mean, what Latoya and Felicia said is beautifully articulated, but I just wanted to add back to Kamala's point, that then it boils back again down to the individual, the director and the chairman, making sure that why are you being invited to join the board in the first place? What are you coming there for? What is your purpose? What are your values? And if we could, and one of the boards that I sit on, there's a call, well, we need directors. I said, well, okay, let's define what it is we need and make sure there's an alignment. What is the criteria? How do we know? What do we put that director through? And we've actually together come up with a process, nothing too fancy, but to ensure that there's that fact finding, so to speak, to ensure that both the individual and the organization, the board, starts to settle and agree that we can work together. Because correct, it's now that amalgamation of the individuals and the board led by the chair that will really help to bring alive the company's strategy and the energy and the commitment that you have at the organizational level, which in itself is a significant entity. Yeah.
Right.
That's
We come to 4:25. Noveck, is it okay if we ask you to give your thoughts and then to give your wrap-up thoughts as well, and so we can
Sure.
finish?
So this basically, I'm going back to your question about fundamentally changing human behavior in terms of how the current board members would receive the feedback or receive difficult questions. And I think there isn't an easy solution to that, but there may be a medium to long-term approach in dealing with how the question may be answered. And it's the issue of board refreshment, board renewal, and grandfathering in the attributes, grandfathering in people on the board who would respond differently than the status quo of they don't want to hear you.
Okay. Yep, that's a key part of it. How do we build that understanding between people and prepare them to be able to receive some criticism about what they may be doing. Yeah, so Derek, if I may invite you to ask your panelists to wrap up now with their key thoughts.
Please, yes. Well, Noveck has shared his part, so if we could ask Felicia and then Latoya to share their closing remarks.
In closing, I think I would say that the discussion has really kind of brought us full circle to really the people side. You know, we often think that governance is about, you know, structures and systems, and we focus a lot on that with our frameworks, and it's important, you know, the architecture, the framework that we put in place, but ultimately it's people that make decisions, and governance is about good decision making. And so if we don't have the right people in place, you know, in the first place, then we will make poor decisions no matter what governance framework we have. So I would say leadership, making sure that we have the right people with all the processes that we use to recruit them, and really focusing on that, you know, cognitive diversity so that we get that challenge and that different thought and perspective.
Thanks, Felicia. Latoya?
Much along the same vein, really, I would say that I would love to leave everyone with 3 points. So firstly, identifying the status quo in order to break it, and then being confident in going about breaking it. And just looking at that process of breaking the status quo as a progressive change. I think if we remind ourselves that that progress counts, even when it's small, we keep ourselves from getting weary. Right? And then lastly, right back to that point of people, Felicia, I think the attitude of our boards at an individual and collective level inform our purpose, and that purpose in turn informs how we're going to treat with people, how we're going to treat our planet, and how we are going to earn sustainable profits. So thank you guys for having me.
So as we wrap up though, there's a very intriguing question that came in the chat from Yolande Christopher, and I want Noveck to address it if he can. It's a big question. So she said it would be interested to hear whether poor cybersecurity measures translate to breaches of a director's fiduciary duty. What would be your thoughts on that?
So I think ultimately the cybersecurity is ultimately the responsibility of the board, right? Now, I'm not familiar with, in terms of it being tied to their fiduciary duty. So I don't have any experience in that particular side of things, specifically with the fiduciary duty. But ultimately, the cybersecurity is part of corporate governance and is ultimately the responsibility and accountability and oversight of the board of directors.
Thanks, Noveck. I would say by the time we are finished with you sharing all that you have shared, especially that figure about only 1% of that $1 trillion being spent on prevention and 99% is on the response, the more our directors learn about that and they become aware, it's actually moving to their fiduciary. So we're moving there. Felicia, go ahead. I think you wanted to.
I was about to say, I would say that it's part of their fiduciary duty. When you look at the impact of cyber incidents, particularly on the financials and how vulnerable a company is, and if you look at some of the outcomes that have happened, where some of the big ones, absolutely, it must be part of what the board looks at, because it is about the best interest of the company, is without a doubt.
Yes. Thank you. All right. So Derek, it is 4:31. So let me thank you.
Yes. Well, let me quickly it's been a pleasure interacting with Latoya, Felicia, and Noveck. It's the first time we've actually gotten together. We did not pre-plan this at all. And the one thing I'll just leave everybody with before I thank CCGI is to break the status quo, just ask the questions, including the whys, and make sure that there's a cost to do something, but what if you don't do it? What happens? And that, I think, if we ask those questions respectfully, boardroom and in other circles, I think it'll start to open some eyes and minds to breaking the status quo. Thank you.
Yes, thank you
Thank
very
you.
much, Eric. Thank you, Latoya. Thank you, Felicia. Thank you, Noveck. What a very, very interesting panel discussion. But, I want to also come to a comment that Charlene has made in the chat, and we could trust Charlene to make these kinds of observations, right? She says, and she's referring, I think, to the status quo, right? She said, if it's not broken, don't fix it. But we are agreeing that something is broken at the board level. What, however, is broken is that the people, the frameworks, the processes, etc. We need to dig very deep to identify what exactly we need to fix. And so I agree with you. I think this panel made it very clear at the people level first. Let us understand the role of directors and then directors' responsibility and accountability. And that is sometimes what is a little bit weak in how we go about governing our organizations. So Charlene, thank you for that very provocative thought as well. So I also want to add that a lot of what we have discussed in terms of purpose and linking it to ISO standards and the values within the organization, let me also bring in something that I know Derek works a lot on, and that is the sustainability development goals. If you're still trying to figure out in your organization what's your purpose, align it with the sustainability development goals and see what impact you are having in the world. What is your impact on people? What is your impact on the environment? What are your impact on stakeholders? And all of that. And that brings us very, very nicely to what would be our final panel discussion for today, where we would look at the value of shareholder and stakeholder activism.